Thank you so much, and it's really lovely to be here today to share in this Heritage Day. So my thanks to all those organising. It was indeed a very exciting time. So in 1916, Easter Monday, as the shots fired and almost 500 people died over the next 6 days of fighting, babies continued to be born during the rebellion of 1916. And of course, this generation of babies would see the formation of the Free State in 1922 and our Republic in 1948. 40 cases of gunshot injury, including men, women, and children, were brought to the hospital during the fighting, and the mortuary of our hospital filled up with the dead brought from the surrounding streets. Never again would the juxtaposition of life and death that we saw in our hospital during these days be so stark. And indeed, the white flag that would stop the carnage of this failed rebellion, it was carried by Elizabeth Farrell, who would later train as a midwife at our hospital. At the time of the rebellion, Dublin was indeed a very poor city, and we had among the worst slums in Europe. The economic climate was really harsh. We had little in the line of organised welfare. Indeed, people relied on local charities and people's benevolence. Many of the workforce in Dublin at the time had little skill, little education, and they relied on casual labour in the docks or perhaps in construction. And there was little in the way of employment protection and little rights for workers. Home was the preserve of mothers who were left somehow to keep their large families afloat. They lived in the worst tenements that you can imagine, and they pawned and they borrowed and they begged to keep the babies after baby born alive and afloat. The newspaper reports at the time are shocking. They chronicle a tale of alcohol abuse, sexual abuse, juvenile prostitution, and prostitution. In fact, the Monto, take me up to the Monto, it was one of the busiest red light districts in Europe with over 1,000 prostitutes on the books in the early 1920s. The rate of sexually transmitted disease in Dublin in 1916 was double that in London. And of course, you had the combination of war after war, from the Great First World War, the rebellion, War of Independence, Civil War, and a high military presence in the city. And this is a very bad combination when it comes to syphilis. Domestic violence was really common, but it was nobody's business. And conditions in the slums were reflected in some of the most appalling maternal mortality rates we've seen. Around 1916, about 350 per 100,000 women died in childbirth, largely of infection and hemorrhage. And the infant mortality rate in the slums was about 150 per 1,000 births. So if we look at those figures today, the maternal mortality rate is about 8 per 100,000 in this country, and the perinatal mortality is about 6 per 1,000. So dramatic differences in terms of childbirth. And of course, illegitimacy was a major problem. Not a huge problem numerically maybe, but for the 1 in 3 children born outside of wedlock, they died. Half of them in the first 2 months of life. And the women who bore them were socially reviled and apparently mysteriously pregnant. The process of incarcerating women was well underway, and by 1900, there were already about 23 Magdalene institutions which incarcerated women having babies outside of marriage. Some women found themselves also in the county homes in a more benign atmosphere, and there was a concept that you had either the redeemable women who maybe were on their first baby outside of marriage and the irredeemable women who went to the Magdalene laundries for increasing reform. But certainly for many of the women, many of them domestic workers in the city, there was really no option for them. And very sadly, some of these women resorted to killing their babies, infanticide, something we talk little about. But Cleaner Ratigan's heartbreaking work of those babies that were killed. And the reports from Ina P., the lady who killed her son because she had not the means to care for him, and she said, "What else could I do?" And in the first half of the 20th century, about 300 cases of infanticide went through our courts. Generally, we tended to give sentences to the Magdalenes, and women spent on average about 3 years, but 12 women were killed for having killed their own children, although this, in 1949, infanticide as a capital offence ceased. So it was really a very difficult time socially, a very difficult time for women, and a very difficult time to birth. And of course, the run-up to 1916 was terribly turbulent. On top of the poverty, we had, of course, the effect of the 1913 lockout on the workers in Dublin and the really profound effects it had on families in the city. Home rule had been achieved by parliamentary effort, but of course this caused in itself its own tensions. And in Northern Ireland, we saw the beginning of the UVF and the beginning of arming the volunteer force. And we had a similar response down south, although to a lesser degree. And we had the Irish Volunteers importing some 9,000 rifles, while the Ulster Volunteers importing a multiple of that, 24,000. And of course, the outbreak of World War in 1914 had a huge effect on our society, even if many of the battles were fought so many miles from our own city and from our own shores. In the first year of World War I, some 80,000 Irish men enlisted, about 40,000 from Northern Ireland and 40,000 from Southern Ireland. They had a range of motivation. For many of them, it was pure economic motivation. And indeed, we had the spectacle of the women spitting at the rebels as they were marched to the barracks following the failed rising, because these women feared terribly that they would lose their pension and the little money they had to feed their children. For others, it was about reconciliation. It was about reconciliation between North and South of Ireland, and indeed between Ireland and England. The first Victoria Cross of World War I was awarded posthumously to an Irishman, Martin Deasy from Mullingar, and he was shot at Mons. In the run-up to 1916, there were many Irish casualties abroad, far more than were killed here in Dublin. We had the carnage of Cape Helles, Suvla Bay, Flanders, and Salonika. And on the 27th of April, while the rising was in full swing, the Germans launched a gas attack in a village close to Luz in northern France with 1,980 casualties and 570 deaths. And many more died from respiratory disease later following the gassing. And for those who survived, the psalm was yet to come. So what of birth? So the first baby born in 1916 was born to Lily Keogh, and her husband was a lamplighter. And I suppose this is uncannily appropriate when we think that the destruction of Dublin and the courage and execution of the rebels after the rising would, of course, light the flame that would further turn the tide of public opinion against British rule. So really symbolic. But what's really interesting is the study of the labour ward register during the week of fighting. So it contains many clues about giving birth in 1916. First of all, there's the volume. 500 babies in total were born in the hospital in the whole year of 1916, compared to 9,500 now. 14 babies were born during the rebellion itself. And the first baby was born at 4:40 a.m. on Easter Monday, and this was baby Murphy, and it was the 15th pregnancy of a woman from South Cumberland Street. She was 40 years old, and her baby boy delivered safely, weighing in at 6 pounds. 2 women out of the 14 were single mothers, and interestingly had no particular address and had clearly come up from the country in order to give birth quietly in Dublin, away from the eyes of neighbours. 5 of 14 women were married to soldiers, and I think this is a really important point. Letters were already arriving all over our country to tell women they were now widows and their husbands were dead, and yet we rarely spoke of this. And perhaps it's only in this commemoration of the Rising that we said it in the context of what was happening in World War I. But so many Irish men dead and never acknowledged, and their families who never spoke about them. And it is not to our credit that this is part of our history. But 5 out of 14 married to soldiers of different rank. And one woman sounded quite posh. She was Constance Harrison Crampton, and she lived very close by in Molesworth Street, just across the way from us today. And she came and delivered her baby in all of the trouble. One woman was already a widow. Her soldier husband dead, and she gave birth to a baby born prematurely. Another woman from City Key had preeclampsia. And what's lovely in the Labour Ward register, you're either well, you're fairly well, or you're not well. So this woman was fairly well, which I think was okay, but she had preeclampsia. Her baby was born weighing 2 pounds, and her baby died after 10 minutes. And of course, nowadays, babies born at 2 pounds have quite good odds of survival in neonatal intensive care, which was not even contemplated or couldn't even be thought about back in 1916. The woman herself was discharged home day 10 and was apparently all right on her discharge. But perhaps the best story is that of Bridget Cox. So she was down at Capel Street and she had to make her way through all the fighting to get to Holles Street to have her baby. But she got caught up in the fighting on the way. She delivered her baby on the street safely, and then she was shot in the foot, and she arrived in the hospital with a baby in her arms and a bullet in her foot. And in fact, in all the excitement in the Labour Ward register, they forgot to record whether her baby was a girl or a boy. But of course, Holles Street was in the middle of the worst of the fighting, and that was, of course, Mount Street, the bloodiest part of the rebellion. And so the young men from England, Sherwood Foresters, fresh out of training, arrived in Dún Laoghaire, and their grenades had gone missing and their rifles hadn't arrived either. And so they were cheered in the leafy South Dublin suburbs of Dún Laoghaire, and they made their way into town, and they got as far as Northumberland Road, where they met the rebels under Mick Malone. And the firing started, and so did the carnage, and many were killed. In a sort of precursor of the Somme, General Lowe, rather than use the many streets locally where they could have just gone a different way, he ordered his men over the bridge to death, and so they kept coming. And there were over 200 casualties and at least 28 people killed. And on the Thursday, the British brought machine guns and explosives, and the rebels were ultimately defeated. De Valera wasn't so far away nearby, and he had 100 people who could have fought and could have helped, but for some reason, they stayed put. But I have an expert now from the 23rd annual report of 1916 from the hospital, and it chronicles the governor's opinion of the staff during 1916. And it says, "For a week, the hospital was the centre of one of the most disturbed areas, and the members of the staff, doctors, students and nurses were indefatigable in their attention to patients, both intern and extern, and regularly visited the extern patients at their homes, often at imminent risk of their own lives. Because, of course, 1,000 babies were delivered directly in the community just beside us, and the doctors and nurses would have had to go out under fire and at great risk themselves to deliver those babies. Although a maternity hospital has no facilities for dealing with accident cases, 40 wounded people were taken in, of whom 7 died in the hospital, and the others were housed and treated until they could be removed to other hospitals. The greatest credit is due to the lady superintendent for the manner in which she maintained the supplies of the hospital during that week, and none of the hospital patients were any of the worse for wear, despite their unpleasant and dangerous experience." Now, I think the lady with the bullet in her foot would probably have disagreed with the governors on that point. When the rebels surrendered, it was Elizabeth Farrell who carried the white flag and the orders to surrender to the various rebel hosts, starting off in the forecourts. It was a dangerous journey over 2 days, and she weaved her way through the fighting. She travelled first to the forecourts and the following morning to the College of Surgeons, General Manel and Markievicz, and from there to De Valera in the Grand Canal Dispensary. And of course, De Valera wouldn't take orders from Elizabeth in the face of surrender, and so she had to go to MacDonough, who was lodged at Jacob's factory. And here in the face of surrender, one young man gave her £3, the money belonging to himself and his brother Michael and Henry O'Hanrahan, and they wanted their mother to have it because they knew they'd die, or felt there was a high likelihood. And one young man gave Elizabeth £13, the money he'd saved for a wedding that he would never have. Now, Elizabeth was quite a character, and I just have taken some excerpts from her description of her journey in the Catholic Bulletin, which was published at the time. And I suppose it's important to remember that as the forecourts fell on the 29th, the rebels tried to make their way, or as the GPO fell, the rebels tried to make their way to the forecourts, but they didn't make it, and they got stuck on Moore Street, and all the women of Cumann na Man were told to get out, and they left, except for Elizabeth O'Farrell and Winifred Carney, and of course Elizabeth's great friend, Julia Grennan, whom she'd grown up with and continued to live with after the Rising. But Elizabeth was quite a character and not easily put off, and she was sent from Moore Street all the way out to Pierce in front of all the fighting, noticing the O'Rahilly lying dead on the street in front of her, and she persevered. She was sent back to get Pierce, came back with a note, sent back again to get Pierce, and sent back the note, and dealt herself with General Lowe. And she records at one stage that she was a minute late of the half hour she'd been given to get back to Moore Street and get back to speak to General Lowe at the top of Moore Street. And she notes that he was rather vexed because I was a minute over the half hour coming, but I really wasn't, as I pointed out, by my watch. And then one of the officers set his watch by mine. So this was not a woman who was easily cowed. And as she went on, she describes crossing the dispensary, and she's trying to get to reach De Valera to give him the news that he must surrender. And she's crossing Grand Canal Bridge, and the firing was terrific. At this point, a man crossing the bridge about half a yard behind me was shot. I called to some people in the houses down the street, and they ran up and they carried him into St. Patrick's Duns Hospital. When I met De Valera, he said, "I will not take any orders except from my immediate superior officer, Commandant MacDonough. So after all my trouble in finding him, I had to go off again." When she travelled further, she ended up making her way back to Dublin Castle. She'd been escorted all the time by the very faithful Captain Wheeler and had kind of a lively exchange with him at various times. She thought she was a guest of General Lowe returning to the castle, but in fact these orders were disobeyed and she found herself locked up, transferred to the ship barracks, and then ultimately to Kilmainham, where she would have joined up with Kathleen Lynn and many other of the rebels. And she wasn't a bit impressed about this because she was a guest of Sir General Lowe. So not to be cowed again, she sent a word to General Lowe to say it was disgraceful that he hadn't obeyed or lived by his own honour, and she was surprised that an English gentleman would go back on his word, at which point she had herself released and dined with Sir General Lowe that evening, and he indeed apologised to her for what had happened to her, and she slightly reluctantly accepted his apology. But she does note at the end of it that, in concluding, I would like to say that I found General Lowe, Captain Wheeler, and Lieutenant Royale most courteous, and there her account ends of the very dangerous journey securing surrender. So when we go back to the annual report of 1916 in the hospital, it chronicles the activities of the hospital during the year. So the hospital provided maternity care, gynae services, and extern services to the community, and with a dispensary service for the poor women of the area. So during the year, 999 women were admitted. There were 539 births in the hospital, 355 gynae cases, and 246 operations. 938 women were attended to in their own homes, and the dispensary saw 2,500 patients. But even then, the hospital operated as a tertiary service, providing an emergency service and specialist opinion for patients from outside of Dublin. There was also a private nursing home operated in number 10 in an effort to generate a few bob for the main hospital, and it was noted that ladies should make early application to avoid disappointment. But of course, medical supplies were very difficult owing to the strain of the Great War. And it's very interesting when we look at the accounts of the hospital. In 1913, it cost approximately £832 to run the National Maternity Hospital. By 1918, that cost had gone up to £1,618 with increased cost in fuel and medical supplies. And today it costs roughly about 70 million to run the National Maternity Hospital. So it's been an upward trend all the way. And of course, there's been many technical advances and hopefully many technical pharmacological advances at the hospital between the years 1894 and the hospital opening in 1916. And we were beginning to understand the need for aseptic techniques. I think Hickwit would argue we have a little bit more work to do, but certainly we were making the link between puerperal fever and maternal mortality. And we also had increasing obstetric intervention in terms of how women delivered and gave birth. And of course, we had a very different population then. Women had rickets. We had genuine problem with contracted pelvis. And so the first cesarean ever performed in our hospital was performed in 1901. And that was a patient called Mrs. T. She was 4 foot 4 inches tall and had a very severely contracted pelvis. And despite a mortality rate of over 50% at the time, Mrs. T survived. and so did her baby. She had lost 4 babies before that, and was discharged home after a mere 30 days, but a very successful operation. The caesarean section rate now in our hospital is 25%, so we see how far things have changed. So, in an echo of today's circumstance, our report chronicles significant infrastructural difficulties, while all hope of improving them must be abandoned until the return of more prosperous times. And indeed, it's noted that the Queen sent a donation of £50, which was very gratefully accepted by the governors. But again, just a final extract from the annual report in relation to the hospital and just the difficulty with all the accounts. The reports tell of magnificent work done by the hospital, but an ever and growing anxiety as to the future of the hospital in view of the condition of the building and the lack of funds. In 1913, the governors sold half of their invested funds to pay off the bank debt and devoted a sum of £1,500 from Lord Ivy to the same purpose. At that date, the architect reported that the original building could not be structurally altered and that the governors should look elsewhere for extension. So the old house was partly reconstructed and made to serve its purpose for another period until times should improve and money required for a new building should be forthcoming. And if you take an extract from any of my annual reports in my first years, it is almost verbatim 100 years later. So here we are. Our difficulties persist, and they're unacceptable. Maternity and neonatal medicine has changed irrevocably, beyond all recognition. The volume of babies delivered in our hospital has increased 20-fold, and the old building we occupy still heaves under the weight of the responsibility, and of course our new infrastructure is needed. But one final word on the women who took part in 1916, not just Elizabeth Farrell, Kathleen Lynn, so many women doctors we should be very proud of. But what happened after 1916? The proclamation talked much of equality and equality for women, and yet in 1919, in the first declared Dáil, although Countess Markievicz made it there, it would take 22 Dáilí and 6 decades before the number of women in an Irish Dáil would number 10. The first bills of the Free State, far from making women more involved in Irish life, took women from Irish life. So we had the Civil Service Examination Bill, which said that women couldn't sit certain exams. The Employment Bill, God forbid, you'd have a male telephonist or a woman in the army, as Kevin O'Higgins said. And you had, of course, as well, the marriage bar, which was only lifted in 1973 on our accession to Europe. Perhaps the biggest difficulty for women, or perhaps the law that had the biggest effect on us, was the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1935, which made contraception not just a moral issue, but actually a criminal offence. And seeing Virgin Megastore prosecuted in 1991 for the sale of condoms give you some idea how long the arm of that law was, and how many women pushed baby after baby after baby into poverty as a result. The debacle of the mother and child scheme, the church's fear of communism and socialism, and that women would have education in the ways of reproduction, a really strong underlying theme in the opposition to that bill, and indeed Archbishop McQuaid's papers revealing his very clear involvement in all the negotiation, and his letter to Archbishop Felici following the failure of the scheme, pointing out that he would be vindicated as a superb prelate that protected the Catholic ethos in our voluntary hospitals, and life would be very grateful to him in subsequent generations. Our accession to Europe, I suppose, was very good for women and made us perhaps look at how women were in our society. And so we've come a long way. But it's taken women in the Free State and in our Republic, I think, a long time to hear their voice. We talked a lot about Mother Ireland, and we talked about the sturdy children and dancing at the crossroads, and well, women have been trying to dance away from the crossroads ever since, I think. We still have some work to do, but we've come a long, long way. And I suppose now it would be nice to see that while we champion birth, it would be nice to see our country investing in it. Thank you very much.